and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I am Kelly Brinkman with BridgeWorks, and we are going to be talking today about millennials and millennials as managers. The fact of the matter is, currently, millennials make up the largest proportion of our US workforce by generation, leading by about 5% over our Gen Xers. And as they become the bulk of our workforce and as they move forward in their careers chronologically, more and more millennials are becoming managers. Now, if we look at the statistics on that, 62% of millennials have direct reports under them. So even though only 25 to 30% maybe have the official title of manager, the fact of the matter is more and more baby boomers are retiring, and more millennials are filling some of those positions. But as we look at the spectrum, millennials are still on the younger side of things. So our conversation today is going to be talking to a millennial manager and discussing how do these younger millennial managers manage older generations like Gen X and baby boomers who may have more years of experience, but millennials may have a new insight on how to work in the workplace. To do that, we have invited from Land O'Lakes, actually a good friend of mine, Emily Tholen. So Emily, I want to first thank you for joining us today. And I would love you have a new job title. It's a mouthful. So I would love you to just introduce yourself to the audience. Tell us a little bit about your background and your current position.
Yeah, thanks for having me today. I'm so excited. Like Kelly said, we're good friends. We've known each other for a very long time, spent a lot of running miles together. So yeah, I've been at Land O'Lakes for over 9 years now. I've spent the last 4 years in our milk replacer enterprise, which is in our animal nutrition area. My new role is associate marketing manager, but that is only as of a couple months ago. I spent the majority of my time here on the animal nutrition side as a technical formulation manager. So I worked in formulation as well as very molecularly with our products. So a lot of experience here, and that's where I had my direct report experience. So when we started this fun conversation, I had direct reports and just so happened to not have them anymore, but plenty of awesome experience to share with you.
Absolutely. So you're working in dairy and dairy milk replacement. Do you actually get to get out there and get your hands on the animals, or are you more on the technical side behind the scenes?
Gosh, I wish I could. Yeah, I've been on a couple trips out with the sales team out to see some calf ranches and some farms. I wish I could spend as much time as possible with those animals. But most of the time I'm in working at a desk at a lab or at the manufacturing plant to make the products and the food for the baby cows.
Fantastic. Yes. So you're a very multifaceted individual. There are a lot of different things we could talk about with you as far as, being a female in a science role, being a mom who works full time. There are all these different dimensions to you. But today we brought you in to be our millennial expert, because we're trying to open up this conversation about how do millennials build credibility and authority if they're managing people who are older than them. Because oftentimes we can get stuck, I'm a millennial myself too, we can get stuck feeling like we're that kid in the workplace, right? And transitions can be tough for everybody. So there's lots of growing pains. But today, like I said, what we want to do is get your experience about managing up people who are older than you. But before we dive in, you just talked a little bit about how many people you've managed in the past. Let's talk a little bit more about that. How many reports would you say have been the most that have been under you at any given time? And what would you guess the generational makeup of that group was?
Yeah, so I had a small group of direct reports. Of course, I do, like most people, a lot of dotted line reporting support. But my direct reports were actually kind of on the far ends of the spectrum. I had somebody who was my parents' age, so I had somebody which would be boomers, right? I
Yep.
think.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. And then I had a Gen Z or just out of college. So she was, I think, in her early 20s. So I had the range of it and both reporting to me at the same time.
Yeah, and we're going to go into how do you manage such a diverse group. But let's start with, so millennials, when millennials showed up on the work scene, every generation sort of gets this bad rap when they first come on the scene, right? Like baby boomers came on the scene and they were accused of being hippies, right? Like get a haircut, you hippie. And then Gen Xers came on the scene with their Nirvana and their plaid, and they were called slackers. Millennials, I think our criticism that was that we came on the scene and we were entitled, right? We have this era of
Yeah.
impatience and entitlement and job hopping. What do you think from a millennial standpoint are some of the misconceptions about millennial managers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, of course, there's that entitlement, and especially when we're working with older people, right? Of course, the mo much of the leadership above me is older than me, and usually, more than 5 years older than me. And so, we get a lot of assumptions that we are, really like very impatient, like that entitlement, right? Like looking to move up, and then also some of the preconceived notion is that we're a little bit like a little lazy, right? Like we do things a little bit differently. Maybe not so much now as like we're starting to see with other generations of getting that kind of reputation, but we came into the world and really were raised in a time of no computers and like really took that on. And so I think I know myself as a manager, I have the apt to use technology in a way that my superiors don't. And so I think that notion of not only like wanting to move fast because I was raised in fast, but also being lazy just because our work looks different. The way I do work and the way I get things done just looks different.
Yes, that is spot on. So at BridgeWorks, one of our foundational services is offering these keynote speeches, and that is one thing that we use to describe the millennial experience is that, we grew up, like you said, at the beginning when our computers were Oregon Trail and dial-up internet, and then by the time we were, out of our teen years and into our college years, we had smartphones and iPods and all of these different things. So there is definitely that innovative side and a reason behind, like you said, why our work style and our thought processes around work look different because we have that innovative out of the box kind of experience. I think that's right on point. Now, communication, right? Communication is a foundational skill. Everybody thinks they know how to communicate, and yet all of these miscommunications end up happening, especially between the generations. So, what do you think is the best way to handle communicating to different generations? And do you even notice? Do you notice or pick up on different nuances of having to communicate differently with different generations?
Yes, absolutely. And I live this every day. Of course, we have management, usually at least one older generation than I am. And there is a lot of emphasis around things in like very complete sentences in writing in emails, or when something is urgent, it's a phone call. And that I have to learn as I come, that's an easier one for me. I come in and these are the expectations, right? I also know that my communication style isn't that. It's kind of somewhere like a little bit less formal. I am accessible in many different ways and kind of a little bit more flexibly available than I would say that my generation above me is. I find that an older generation is more uncomfortable with receiving things like IMs and text messages. And it's a little bit more awkward for them just because that's not what they grew up with, right? And then I had the younger generation, and that's such a different experience as well. They want to sit and they want to talk. Like there's a lot of work that happens in collaboration where they just want to sit and have a verbal conversation, or they'll accept an IM, or a text message is very common, like very, very uncommon for me to call them or send them a huge long email that isn't meant to be like documenting something in writing. So it's like this huge spread between the top and the bottom of the generations I work with. And so just having to make sure to be very clear about what works for you. Because even when I talk about different functions of different generations, like the sales team that's out on the road, they tell me like an email is important. And in my mind, a phone call is important, right? So, not only operating with the different generations with different communication styles and being very vocal about my own needs and finding out theirs, also understanding that it differs from person to person and in function to function.
Yeah. And I think something you said there really struck a chord with me, has to do with, maybe older management styles. And I'm guessing here, or I'm sort of stereotyping, but maybe the older managerial styles, the older generations, it was more like do what the boss says, end of sentence, end of story, right? Whereas I'm sort of hearing from you as a millennial that you are, like you said, more flexible in understanding to get the most effective communication with your team may require different approaches. And I think that's
Really.
really important for people to hear, especially if you're moving from a position of just being, if you're the top accountant and then suddenly you get promoted to the manager of accountants, that's a completely different role. So I think it's a great insight as far as understanding how to manage those people. Specifically, do you ever sit down with the people you're managing and just say, what is your preferred communication style?
I do with some of the older generation more commonly, right? I think that I tend to gravitate towards I'm on the younger millennial side, so I tend to gravitate towards the way that Gen Zers communicate now. Like that feels more natural to me because I grew up texting and I grew up on AOL chat and all those things, right? So it's like more instant, smaller words, no full sentences. But I know that that's not always how I'm inclined. So I want to make sure to sit down formally with somebody who's used to getting something very structured, it's very complete, and ask them, does that matter to you? Because some are more flexible than others, right? Some are more interested in learning about how you otherwise can communicate. Some are not. So I find that the most important. Not to say I don't also do it with my younger employees, but I also feel like they're more aware of what works for them because they're aware that there are options and they're aware that there are a lot of options. And so they
Yeah.
know when they can inform me what works best.
Yeah, that's so true. As technology changes, I did a presentation yesterday and I said, there are more and more ways to connect than ever before, but that also means there are more and more ways to miscommunicate than ever
Yes.
before. Um, Now, let's see. So previous generations, I just alluded to this. So the baby boomers, it was very like hierarchical. Like you had a boss, the boss had a boss, and you only talked to like your direct report above you. They were more self-sufficient. It was like, I have my job, I just have to figure out how to do it, right? Versus, and you alluded to this, millennials and Gen Z, who like a much flatter organization where we're collaborating with everybody on every level. So, first of all, would you say that fits your observations as a manager? And then, how do you persuade or get buy-in and cooperation of someone from a different generation to maybe work outside their preferred style?
Yeah, so I do experience this quite a bit. There's so much about the historical structure in businesses. When you move a lot slower, it makes sense to have this like very rigid, like this is how the work is elevated and this is how the work is accomplished. And with this like ever-changing world we're in, where we need to be working faster than we already have been, it becomes really hard to make that work for everyone, especially the new generation coming in that is only ever used to the rapid pace. And they like to be just talk to everybody, get it done, we'll do it all together. And so sometimes there's a clash. Even I have that experience where I'm talking to somebody who's a couple levels up from me, and I'm told to go to the director below them because that's who's supposed to own the information. But as with the mindset of like this ever-changing, let's get it done with all together, it can disrupt the structure that exists. So that employee that I had is much older. He knew his function and he was very good at drawing lines in his boundary. He like, this is my job and I report it up and that's how I get things done. And then I had a new employee come in who's like, I'm going to go talk to the VP about this decision you made because I think differently and I have this information. And so, that's even just hearing about that can be quite upsetting to the older generation, right? They don't understand why that would be done because it's just different, right? We're just different human beings. And so I've had to explain that like even myself, like I want to speak to the leader, not because I want to go above you or not because we need to go outside of our bounds and do something different, but because everybody's a human and we all just are working to get our jobs done, and that person has an answer that I need. And so really just making sure that in no matter these situations, right? Every single person is a person. And so making sure to be aware of like somebody's preconceived notions about how work is done and how work is accomplished, or even how we communicate in our structure is different. And so seeking understanding from them on what matters to them. And really, I mean, that man's job, he wanted to get something done. So like he wants to move his information up and my Gen Zer wants to move from information out. And so everybody's just trying to get something done. And so just seeking understanding about what they're trying to accomplish can make it a lot easier for them to understand each other and to get their job really accomplished.
Yeah, I think open and clear communication is paramount. And I think you're absolutely right that younger generations, we had parents who the parenting style was like, let's include you in the conversation. Let's hear how you feel. And so when we get into these workplace environments, of course, it's natural that we feel that leadership should be accessible because, our parents and our coaches were accessible to us. So I think that's
Yeah.
a great observation. Um, Now, going in, and obviously people remain anonymous, but can you think of a time when you had a conflict as far as an older generation, either an Xer or a baby boomer, who maybe challenged you as a manager and sort of maybe was a little bit dismissive because you were a younger generation? And if so, how did you handle that?
Yeah. So, um, oftentimes, like, yeah, I am quite young as a manager. I was new in my role as a manager. And then I oftentimes have people who I work with that are much older and that are in leader levels the same as mine or above mine. So there, there's have been opportunities where I work with people who are older, again, not direct reports, but they have their way of doing things. It needs to be done written down. It needs to be done by hand, and that is how things are done. And my approach isn't always that way. I also know that as a curious person, but also as a millennial, where I was asked my opinion on things and where my parents asked for my feelings, I ask questions, and that can be really challenging for people. And so when I'm asking a question like, "Why do you do that by hand? Is there a better way to do that? Have you thought of that?" Can be come across very like attacking because that from what I understand, that man felt like this is how I do it, and this is the right way to do it. And for him, that is real. And for me, I'm asking questions to understand how might we do it differently? And that's not always been a welcomed experience, especially when it comes from somebody younger than you, because it's very challenging, right? Unless you have the mindset of like, oh, how might I do that differently? How the notion of what is done right and how things are done just so different in the generations, and my challenging or even just asking questions is tough. So try to explain myself, right? The best we can do is say like, hey, I'm just trying to understand what you're doing. I don't like devalue what you do, but I want to understand how I can make your life easier and show you how.
Yep, I think that's awesome. And I want to remind everybody who's listening, not only will this be recorded and replayed later on our BridgeWorks YouTube channel, but we will have an opportunity at the end, the final like 10 or 15 minutes, to open the floor to conversation. So if you are typing questions in the chat right now, we see you, we love you, we're so glad you're here, and we will get to those questions at the end. So whether it's Emily or myself answering, we will tackle all of those questions coming up. All right, so Emily, Gen Z. So we talk about you managing the older generations. Now there's Gen Z, right? So
Mhm.
every time a new generation, like I was saying before, comes on the scene, it's like, oh my gosh, who are these people? They're aliens. How do we relate to them? Gen Z is particularly interesting to all of us because they have grown up with smartphones. Like some of them have had smartphones since they were 8 years old. And by now, the statistic is out there that 95% of American Gen Zers have cell phones. So they are constantly connected, right? And they have access to the worldwide information, to social media, to all of these platforms. So their minds and their framework on work and values and morals and behaviors has transitioned from generation to generation as they do. Um, and when you're managing a Gen Zer who has all of these new ideas, these new experiences with tech, what are some of your recommended or what have you found to be your best strategies to connect with the younger generation?
So, and connect with them is like communicate with them or just like
Yeah, and get them, the one of the biggest reasons we see turnover with Gen Z employees is because they don't feel either their work is meaningful and purposeful or they don't feel a part of the organization.
sure.
That's a great clarification point. So
Yeah.
how do you get them to, number one, come on board and like you are a part of this
Yeah.
organization and feel like they're welcome in that environment because that's very important. And then number two, how do you make them understand that even in an entry level job, your role is meaningful to our bigger picture?
Yeah. Great. I have the experience managing a Gen Zer, and that is so present. She showed up on her first day and was already onboarding faster than I did when I started, and she was really taking a portion of my job. And so I watched her be really apt with the technology, like the systems we use. She really in a way I've never seen before. I watched somebody come on board when they usually say, takes a year to get to know a job, but she was on board and moving at 6 months. And so one of the bigger things I did for her was like, just don't backseat her. She doesn't want to be backseated. She does not want to sit and watch. She's from a generation that where she is doing, she's constantly engaging and working and thinking. And I find that, and it might just be her, but really this generation of kids that, and I call them kids, gosh, I
I
shouldn't do
know.
that.
I do.
This generation of people who just like ask a lot of questions. They like want to understand things because I feel like they grew up in a generation where they grab their phone and they're like, I'm going to find out. I'm going to find out what that's about. And so I feel like just making sure to encourage that and overcoming the common like notion of, oh, it takes time. Oh, you have to learn the ropes, and just actually giving them a bit of that agency to go and learn and make mistakes and be very, very verbal about that too. They want to communicate, they want to talk about it. If over messaging, great. Otherwise, verbally, they want to hear about how they're doing, what they can do, and like just let them run. Which is so contrary to what I heard. There's a lot of laziness, like, oh, they don't want to work because they have their phones. Like, there's nothing to do. They want to make content for TikTok. Like, but I'm watching them show up and they not only care about how they perform, but like they care that how they get it done and the speed that they get it done, and they want to be involved. And yeah, and there's so much about being a part of a mission. I noticed that too. There's a bit of like boredom, right? That comes with like, I show up to a job, I master it, I'm really good at it, I make it better than I found it, and then I'm out. Like, I want to go check something else out because they're so used to this like onslaught of information. And I can't blame them. Like, it's kind of fun. Like, if your job isn't to sit and grow with a business through a structure that's all existed for years and years and years, then it's off to go understand the world in a different way. So at Land O'Lakes, we focus a lot on our co-op structure. It's giving, we're owned by our members, like the people who milk the cows own us. And so I find it very easy at Land O'Lakes to give people that like goosebump feeling of like passion and drive, because we do work to make value for the farmers that give us their milk. And so it's a really awesome thing, and it's kind of like roped her into her role in a wonderful way because she's super capable. And but just changing that perception of doing it differently and wanting to come in and be engaged really quickly, that's okay, and we should foster that.
Yeah. And I think that's awesome to hear because at BridgeWorks as well, we have all these organizations and companies coming to us with questions about generations in the workforce. And one of them has been, how do we engage and how do we retain these Gen Z employees who, like you said, there's a misconception that they are lazy when in fact maybe they're understimulated, maybe they're feeling underwhelmed and under challenged by their roles. So I think it's great that, like you said, you sort of take the reins off and let them go and do and be and sort of explore within your company. I think that's an awesome note for people to take away if they're managing down to those Gen Zers. Now, inevitably, as a manager, again, like I said, you could be the best food scientist in the world, but suddenly you get into a management position, and not only are you doing the science now, but you are handling people. And that is a tricky, tricky role to be in. So, can you think of, or can you sort of discuss this concept of having to navigate or to mediate some sort of conflict between your workforce when maybe from the outside you can recognize right away that it's a generational difference?
So yes, great representation with that younger employee of mine, having to manage her through a situation where she was working with a much older gentleman, like getting ready for retirement, has served us so well in his many, many, many years here at Land O'Lakes. But they both are working on a project that relates to how they pull numbers together for like a monthly or a weekly report. And for this older generation, young or old man, or God, what am I doing?
That's
This
okay.
man.
It's a reference point.
I try and go young to
It's
old, and then
relative,
I'm like,
right? I'm
yeah,
old to a Gen Zer, so I get it. We get it.
okay, yeah. And yes. Okay, thank you. There's an older man, and for him, it's manual, right? Like I mentioned before, there's a lot of that, like I do it with my hands. I pull all the information so I know where it came from. I know where I want to put it. I know how I like went and did the math. I know it all lives here because I touched it all. It takes a long time, right? That takes a long time. And for my new employee, she's so used to using resources that just doesn't, that's not her natural inclination. So instead, she goes to AI. She uses Copilot here and is looking for an answer and is looking to pull this information together without actually having to manually do it. And for the older generation, he was like, that's not right. It can't be right. Like both of them clash on saying that takes too long. How do you know you're not making mistakes? And the clash down was, you can't use somebody else to do your work. How do you know that it's right? And so we have this conflict, right, that lives between somebody who's harnessing the software that we have in place and somebody who understands that it's important to know what is going in and coming out of your work, right? So understanding too that it's just about how each of them were brought up, right? One of them is used to using that system, and one of them is used to doing it by hand. And so ultimately break down the function at all. We're really just trying to do our best with what we know. And so working with him to understand like, hey, I know that manual made sense for you, especially when you were writing on paper before we used Excel regularly.
Yeah.
And I know that that's valuable for you. Can you appreciate that she does it differently and gets the same answers? What would help you feel comfortable with the methods? Because it's really just a change in the method used, the answer should be the same. And so having to be just a human with them and understand like why their strong opinions come about one way or another, and then getting them to understand, just like, seeking that understanding between them so that they can work together on helping each other understand what might be beneficial about either thing, and then coming into a solution together.
Yeah. And one thing I loved, it's kind of coming up over and over again that, you're looking at this as a manager from, a human side that, each person is different. You recognize the generational differences based on the formative experiences. What tools did they have available? What technology did they have available? What was the corporate structure like, in their heyday or their era? And I think that's really important because at BridgeWorks, we do these presentations and we talk about, compromising or trying to meet each generation where they're at. And sometimes people will push back and say, well, that's not me being my authentic self. But I think we have to step away from that sort of, I'm not being authentic by approaching these people with the humanity of understanding. So I think that's really critical that you point out, incorporating, switching your methods is more of a tool for you than something that is making you, be, four different people with four different generations. Would you kind of agree with that?
Yeah, there's so much about the tool of emotional intelligence too, right? So a tool is a technique, and I completely agree that yeah, there might be a notion that we are being different people, but ultimately, I need to show up as myself in different ways to different people to help them understand and to encourage them and give them what they need to feel productive, and they need to feel heard and liked and all the things that we as basic humans need. And so that emotional intelligence and understanding in that room with the older generation, he needs something different from me than the person at the younger. And I'm still very much myself. And so thinking of it as a common tool that lives in both of those situations.
Yeah, I think that's really important because, like I said, more and more the younger generations want to be their authentic self, and having to coach them on, changing your approach doesn't mean you're changing yourself. You
Yeah.
can still be true to yourself. You can still be, who you are and your values and your methods, but understanding you are a small part of a larger organization.
Yeah.
On the heels of that, if we're talking about coaching, we at BridgeWorks have noticed there seems to be a different way to motivate or different preferred incentives for generation to generation. Would you say you observe that as well? And how do you motivate? Do you have any particular approaches that you use from the older baby boomers to, Gen X, who's right above you, to the Gen Zs that are below you when it comes to how to motivate them on the job?
Yes. So I and this goes back to some of the other stuff that we talked about, right? There is existing this historical structure that lives. So when like the old ways, like the way my parents went to work, and there's always like there's so many managers in place and directors and values, and then the way that you were celebrated was through pay or was through like a holiday party. And so I find that my Gen Z or Gen Xer that was above me or boomer even, his need for recognition didn't look like anything but those two things, right? It was like this party we had at the end of the year, or it was pay. And so yeah, I mean, if that's how when you came into the working world, if that's what success was celebrated with, then that's what you're going to be looking for. And then my Gen Zer comes in, and we were wanting more of like verbal encouragement, right? We got that from our parents. We lived that. And I, on the young end of the millennials too, like when I was celebrated, it always wasn't a thing. It was an experience, right? Even just the experience of being celebrated in a public meeting or being given an award that's on your workday, or, things that show up very differently because they're in a generation where it wasn't just about the physical approval or, the physical stuff. So making sure to understand that. Another wonderful thing I made sure to do, and I was trained in as a manager by a wonderful manager who told me, like, you got to get to know yourself, and you have to get to know the people. And so you want to know what makes them tick, like what do they like, what do they need, how do they work, and really like how can you celebrate them so that they feel successful in their role. And so making sure to ask that question, how do you like to be celebrated? How do you like to know you've done a good job? And so I feel like while it may seem like an awkward question to ask, it's actually not, because someone gets to talk about themselves. They can be like, well, I really like getting a bonus, or I really, so I fully recommend that, and notice the differences in the needs.
Yep. On the heels of that, you're leading great into this snowball conversation. Um, a lot of times we do recommend, as a manager, again, your main role is managing people. You do have your technical side of your job as well, but you as a manager, typically one of your top priorities is your people. And some of the pushback when we tell, some of our advice is, sit down, like you're saying, sit down and have a conversation with each of your direct reports. What is your preferred method of communication? How do you like to be recognized? What motivates you? How can I help you? And the pushback from this advice is usually, I don't have time for that, because, as a manager, as a millennial, you're probably, balancing family life and personal life and this, that, and the other, but it's, you don't have time for that. What would you say to people who are moving into manager positions, who are already in manager positions, who bring up this pushback and say, I just don't have time to get to know my people?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think again, from the older generations, the way that they build that structure is that your work is quantifiable, right? You have a number in your mind of the time spent on things, and that is worth money. And while I don't disagree, like time is money when you're getting things done for an organization, how we use that time is so different now. We have tools that we can start to learn that can help us simplify our time, and also time spent with somebody that you are meant to encourage, understand, motivate, to help you with things, to all the things that are meant are not quantifiable about human beings
Yeah.
matters even more than the numbers, because if you can convince that person, or you are able to get the trust from that person that they're important, that you hear them, that you're giving them what they need, and that you understand when things don't go right, that person's going to stick around longer than somebody who wasn't worth your time. So that quantity and quality piece always matters. And I knew that when I came into my role, and something I really recommend is when I came in with an intentionality. I want to be a people manager because I want to help people. It is not about me, it's about them. And so I told myself that when I sat down with her, sat next to her every single day, that if she had a question for me, unless I was in the middle of something super critical, I would turn and I'm gonna hear her, and I'm gonna ask her for what she needs, and I'm gonna help her, because she has turned, she is improving end over end on her capabilities. And I attest that to the intentionality around managing as a person with them. So I
Absolutely.
never think you always have time.
Yes, yes, I think that's great. And I love, we're having an audience here to hear these messages because, again, whether it's a Zer or a millennial who is thinking about or is expecting to move into a managerial position, or maybe it's that Gen Xer or that baby boomer has been in their role and they feel burnt out or they feel like, they can't reach their employees anymore. Like, what has changed about them? That is a very critical observation. Like, having intentionality and carving out that time because like you said, time is money, but if you take one chunk of 15-minute time now and get exponential returns on that investment, I think it's well worth it. Now, work-life balance, right? This has become, especially since the COVID pandemic, and we'll kind of pair this with work environment, but the whole work-life balance thing from a generational standpoint, we have sort of seen evolve. When it comes to observing the generations in your workplace and the people you have managed, what would you say your observations about the expectation of work-life balance is, and how do you approach that with people who maybe aren't feeling satisfied with the work-life balance? And just to give you context, like, baby boomers, when they came into the workplace, there were 80 million people competing for jobs. And so if the boss said, hey, I need you to come in early and stay late, baby boomers kind of said, absolutely, boss, my family can take a back seat. This career is important to me. And then as each generation has moved on, it's sort of been a little pullback saying, you know what? My time and my mental health are a little bit more important than sacrificing everything for this company. So, what has your observations and experience been like when it comes to that and the different generations in your workplace?
Right, yeah. So when I started in my role here on the animal nutrition side 4 years ago, or about there, I was told like the boss expects that you're here 8 to 5 every day. There's no leaving at 3:30. You are expected to be here because that is how productivity is measured. And I knew right away like that was hard because I had a less than 1 year old when I started, and I was actually pregnant with another one when I started. And I was like, how is this going to work for my life? I know that I'm really productive, but I just can't stay till 5. So is this going to be kind of the downside and like the reason I leave eventually? Um, but as that boss got to know me and saw my effectiveness in the hours that I was here and my willingness to hop on in like the hybrid environment where I could work from home in the evening, I got a little bit of leeway, and it helped me really like, very intentional, like noting like this really matters to me to be able to be present as a parent and get my work done because I'm super passionate about what I do, and I really think I can make a difference with this company, but I need a little help doing it on my time. And so when I had direct reports at the same time, I was very aware that to me, if you're getting your job done, you can do it throughout your day, but getting your job done looks like a few things. It's being in the meetings you're asked to be in, it's getting the information out to the right people at the right time, and it's also making sure you want to show up tomorrow. Like if you don't want to show up tomorrow because you're burned out because I make you work too much, or you just can't make it in because you have something else on your mind from work, that I mean that's a number one thing too. Like this soup it matters. And so when I talk to my employees, I say, get your work done. That matters. Also, like your life matters to me too, and who you are and how you show up. So I want you to be happy, and I want you to be healthy, and I want you to work with me. So let me know what that looks like for you, and then we'll just work together to figure that out. Like understanding the flexibility of lives matters so much, and like COVID really gave us the opportunity to explore that. And I know I need that too in my life. Like some days I'm in at 7 a.m. Sometimes I'm gonna have to start school or start at 9:30 because kindergarten starts at 9:30. And so it's just what it is. And I would say our productivity has not changed at all. But these generations really just have different expectations just purely because like what we started in. And those Gen Zers also understand like my world is virtual, so I might as well work virtual. And just it's really helpful. Remember, always coming back to like if I don't agree with somebody's take on an opinion on like if we need to be here 8 to 5 or if we need to work like every 10 minutes for the whole day, like I probably just don't understand. So like the frustration or the or like the not understanding means I just need to seek it, right? They're people, they're trying to get things done, and there's a reason why they want to work in the way that they do. So let's just be, have that emotional intelligence to be able to get everybody to work the way they need to.
Yep. I think that's so important to recognize, as again, as we're talking about generations in the workforce at BridgeWorks, I always kind of joke about like, when Gen Xers first introduced casual Fridays, baby boomers probably lost their minds. And it was like, how in the world, we need to show up and be professional, which means wearing a suit, which means women are wearing skirts and all of this, that, and the other. And then these crazy Gen Xers show up this with this idea of wearing denim on Fridays and how scandalous, right? But now that's a very accepted norm. And there's even like business casual and things have evolved. So when we're hearing about these ideas of, Gen Z saying, why don't we switch to a 4-day work week? And everybody's going, clutching their pearls and saying, scandal, scandal. Like I could see in, 5 years, us that being the norm. European countries, they talk about all the time, have 3-month summer vacations and their economy still runs pretty strong. So I think, like you said, it's important to recognize that just because your idea of, a work schedule and certain parameters are different doesn't make you any less passionate about your work, and it doesn't make you any less effective. So that's super
Yeah.
important.
And just a note on that too. I think about it too as I hear you talk about it, being the millennials, like how open we are to being both ways. Because I think, like you said, we grew up both ways. I grew up with a TV like catalog that we figure out what's on TV, and then I also grew up with Instagram. So like this whole like I think that as a millennial manager, you can come in and you can really kind of see like how the world could change because we've seen it, right? You could watch the world transition and like being okay with kind of both types of norms,
Yep.
because we've seen all kinds of norms in our just short generation.
I think that's super important. And obviously the best generation, millennials. No, I'm just kidding because we're both millennials. But I do think we were and are uniquely positioned from that standpoint. Because like I said in the introduction, and like you just alluded to, we maybe started by playing Oregon Trail on our computers, but then by the time I was in college, I can remember, downloading music using LimeWire and these social media platforms and setting my 8 top friends on MySpace. Like that was a relatively short period of time with some very rapid expansion in technology and even evolutions from the early versions of technology to the later versions. And I
Yeah.
think moving forward, it's important to acknowledge, Gen Z is going to be even more savvy than we are, and having that, keeping that in mind as a valuable trait versus,
Mhm.
they're disrupting the system. On that note again, if I had to ask you, I'm putting you on the spot here. We didn't discuss this prior to
Oh,
our
no.
call, but if I had to ask you, thinking about maybe a baby boomer employee you've had, an Xer, a millennial, and a Gen Z, what would you say are like the most advantageous traits that, each generation sort of brings to the table? So if we're trying to get like the best out of each generation, what would you say each has to offer?
Okay. So you're gonna have to help me
Sorry.
with this one.
Yep.
That's okay. So I think again, from my perspective, I
Yes.
think the one of the more wonderful things about the older generation, like there's several people I work with who are just getting ready for retirement, is that they also have seen a lot. They have a lot of experience. And when they get to being that generation in the workplace, they have a lot of ways of saying, that didn't work before. And we ask why. They're really good at poking holes in things because they've seen it before. They watch the market change, or they can see things in a different light because they've lived 30, 40 years at this company, and watch it transform. So that's really cool, right? We sometimes it can be negatively tied to like, oh, they always say no, they never want to do anything, but it's or like they have such a negative take on it. But we need those people too. Like we can't always just be all happy about somebody's idea because we're missing something. So that would be the older generation. To say the generation that's right above me. Um, let's see, what are they best at? Probably a lot of things. I think that there is that's probably the harder one, Kelly. Like I could because they are I feel like from my perspective, they tend to gravitate towards thinking like the older generation, like especially about work, right?
Yep.
You are a director and then you are a VP, and like that, there's a pecking order and it happens that way. And there's a lot of emphasis on that. But
Yep.
you can see I was raised by some of those people, like the older generation version of them. And so you can see that they start to really understand like the emotional awareness a little bit too. And so they're balancing a lot, trying to manage that. And I think that they were like kind of at the cusp of like this, your mental health matters, or who you are as a person matters. It's not just about the metrics that you like push out in your work.
Yes.
Um, and then like we've talked about, millennials have a huge appreciation for people who come up in a generation where we went through to 2008 bank stuff, like all of the challenges we faced when we've gone from no computers all the way up through computers in one generation. Like I think there is so much agility that lives there. And I watch it in the way even non-managers handle themselves. They like, just can see different ways of working. And then the younger generations have this awesome way of using very little of their time to actually physically do work, but accomplishing so much.
Yeah.
And they've got this innovative mindset on because they've worked in the depths of the internet in ways that many of us older people have not, that they kind of can think about the world in terms of like things like AI. Like they can think about like, I'm saying, oh, I have a problem because I have this standard, these numbers I want to hit, and none of the other places can hit that number. And they're like, well, why don't we just create a machine learning setup so that we can like every single person can operate exactly where they need to go. And like they can pump that out in a couple days. It's amazing. And so
Yeah.
their ability to think differently than the rest of us is just remarkable. And I think that everybody, we really do appreciate everybody's different perspectives, but I think where we stop ourselves is that it feels unusual because we're not used to it. And we have a hard time making sense of it. So it can feel like I got to defend myself. But more than anything, it gives you the opportunity to be like, why? Or tell me more, or like help me understand. And I think that that really helps us like all bridge together and work
Yeah.
as one.
I think that's so important. Coming from a place of curiosity versus like accusatory or defensive is always going to be a better approach in terms of whatever generation you're working with. So I think that's really insightful. And I couldn't help but giggle because at BridgeWorks, I often joke, that Generation X feels like the Jan Brady, which is a generational reference, but like the middle child who is forgotten. So it gave me a little bit of a giggle. But Gen Xers, you're out there. We love you. My boss is a Gen Xer. He's the best boss ever. Just little brownie points there. But now we want to switch gears. Emily, you've been so insightful and thoughtful. We're going to bring you in. We have a couple questions from our audience. So I'm going to look up here at our chat. What new challenges and benefits are you noticing as more millennials step into leadership roles? I think that's a great question. Maybe just the
Yeah, that
evolution of
is.
workplace. Yeah.
Right. So, in addition to the millennials being really able to be flexible, and I think, like I said, see kind of both realities of like very structured old way of doing things and very like new open-mindedness to potential like new ways of doing work. Um, I think that there is a real connection to emotions and mental well-being. And so I think that I've watched a lot of millennials show up in conversation and be really aware of how they talk and what they say and be really willing to be humans with people, and knowing that underneath your effectiveness and your capabilities and your technical skill is a person trying to do a good job that's driven by a couple of different things. So I would say that one of the bigger challenges that I see millennial managers face is that we are being managed by people who don't really understand that we don't actually care that much about the fact that there is a structure and there's a pecking order. Like, I really don't actually care that much about that. So I'm going to go talk to the VP if he's walking down the hall and I have something to talk to him about. Like, I'm going to be friendly with him and I'm going to ask him questions. And that's that we face a lot of pushback for that. And that's okay. Right? They didn't come up in a place or in a time where that mattered, and that was okay. And now it does. And now I do it. And now the people below me even do it because they are calling up on the phone our VP of all of our ag, R&D, and their butts, right? So like, it's I think the willingness, like we are up against a lot, but our willingness to be flexible and really think differently and understand where they're coming from and where we know the world is coming from, that awareness of what's happening in the generations below us is just something we're going to have to work towards and really, like, again, make the bridge with the people older than us here, understand what my intentions are, my, like the frustration or the, gaining the like the mutual understanding of each other's intentions really matters. So I watch them do that. We have to be agile and we're going to be different.
Yep, yep. I think that's super important. All right, we're going to jump into another question here. In thinking about the example of younger employees using AI and the older employee doing the task by hand, what would you say the responsibility is of an older employee or an older generation to have a growth mindset? So how do we bring them on board with, doing it, like you said, sort of the human approach, sort of, questioning them about it from a more curious standpoint. But do you think there's anything specific we can do to help them with that growth mindset? And
That's a
again,
great
we're putting you on the spot, so
Yeah,
no.
that's okay. That's a great question. And you have to remember, back up from that growth mindset thing completely and think about change management. These people who lived through a lot of more consistency than we ever did are now going through like change, 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 change. And so they haven't had the opportunity to go through change management and like come to terms with the process. And so for them, this is like a complete attack on everything that they know. And so there's a lot of like, again, that defensiveness. And so I've learned through some courses here at Land O'Lakes, some of our, through our Growing Leaders program here, that it's really important to even just verbalize that to them. Say like, this is hard, right? It's hard. It's not something you're used to. And there's probably something about it that you don't trust. And then listening to them, because there's, if you were asked to go like, step out of your office right now and go do a backflip, you'd be like, I can't do that. But someone would have to show me how to do it, and I'd have to make sure I was safe, and I'd have to make sure somebody could, like there's all these little things that would need to come into play for me to feel like I could go and do that. And maybe this older generation person who has a negative mindset or non-growth mindset just doesn't have the training or the support that they need to learn it. And so just keeping it from that perspective, again, like how much should they be required to, hop on the bus with us as we're driving down the road with AI? Like,
Yeah.
sure, they should be required, but we got to help them because they're like the little kids that we're teaching how to like, make the table for the first time. We just have to help them.
Yep. And I think it's important too to acknowledge because again, we'll hear pushback, the younger generation saying, "Oh, old people just don't get it." And then the older generation saying, "What's wrong with kids these days?" Right? And the whole idea is that it's everybody is coming, we are coming from four distinct backgrounds. And so like you said, there needs to be a mutual respect. There needs to be a mutual understanding. The baby boomers with the experience may look at the Gen Zers who are making some of the same mistakes and like different processes that they have already learned and grown through. And then, like we are saying, with the Gen Z could maybe teach the baby boomers on technology. But I think, those reverse mentorships and those partnerships are the way we're going to grow everyone. And I think there needs to be patience on both sides. I think of my mom when my mom sends me a text message and it's a whole big book long and I'm rolling my eyes going, "Mom, like if it's this important or if it's this long, just call me. Like don't send me a book and a text." But then I'll text her Kay and she's upset because she thinks I'm mad at her, right? Like we both get frustrations for different reasons when we're both just communicating in our style. So, whether it's the mindset on technology, whether it's the approach to work ethic, I think having that mutual understanding that patience is going to be required for everybody. Nobody wakes up in the morning and is like, how can I be difficult today? Right? Like we're all trying to understand and work together better, especially in the workplace where like the more productive our organization can be, the more fruitful everybody can be. So I think that's
Yeah.
very important. Any final thoughts? We're kind of wrapping up our time here. We want to thank again everybody who has stuck with us this far. We really appreciate it. And we will post, I did see a question about the YouTube channel. I am not the technical wizard behind this show. We have a Gen Zer for that. Shouting out to you, Jazzy. Um, we will make sure we'll communicate through our BridgeWorks social platforms on how you can rewatch this episode coming up very shortly because it will be reposted and be able to be viewed whenever and wherever you'd like. But Emily, we want to thank you for your time. And are there any final thoughts or strategies or advice that you would have to our audience about anything millennial or managing or anything like that? This is your time to shine. Any final advice for all of us?
Yeah. So, I mean, not anything we haven't already heard. I think really focusing on growing our emotional awareness muscle is going to be really helpful in a lot of this. Being aware of each other's emotions and everybody else and what drives them as human beings is like at the very, very basic level in how we work. And so as a manager, especially in the millennial area, I fully recommend that you just think and read and learn and engage in things that are helping you learn about how to be socially and emotionally aware. So that would be my advice for you. I would say,
Yeah.
growing up in a millennial era too, being raised by older Gen Xers, that I kind of have this notion of wanting to be perfect, like wanting to do everything right, because and that is a very personal challenge as well. But like I come from a structure or a generation of parents that measured success by words, numbers, grades, things like that. And so for me, I'm pretty hard on myself. And so give yourself grace, just like you're going to learn through emotional awareness that you need to give people grace, give them patience, give it to yourself too. Because as a people manager, you're never going to be perfect. There's always going to be something somebody will tell you you're not doing right, or don't like about it. And just give yourself grace, like, all right, I'm not perfect, but am I showing up as that authentic self where I am emotionally aware, present, transparent, kind? As long as you're those things, you're doing a good job. And the more you're listening to things like this and working with BridgeWorks and understanding and reading the content they have for you, the better you're off, or you will be off as a leader.
Yeah, I think that's great, and that's very important. Like you said, staying true to yourself, but staying open to understanding that you're never going to please everybody, and you just have to show up as yourself and do the best you can. I think that's probably some of the best advice anybody can get. So thank you, Emily. We want to thank you for your
Yes.
time again. So that's Emily Tholen with Land O'Lakes. We're talking about all things millennial and managing. I want to remind you these community conversations with BridgeWorks, we're trying to put them together every month or so, based on our, keynote speaking schedule, which again, check out BridgeWorks if you want to schedule a keynote presentation for your organization. But our next couple of community conversations will involve transitioning back to the office as we approach, back to school time. And as people are switching all of these COVID, restrictions being lifted and things like that, pandemic hopefully is in our rear view mirror. We're talking about, how do we get people comfortable coming back to their work environment? How much should we be coming back to our work environment? And then September, as Emily and I discussed with Gen Zers, AI and the future of work. People, the robots are coming for us. No, I'm just kidding. But definitely artificial intelligence is out there, and it's only going to become more and more prevalent in our workplaces. And so we want to be able to harness the power of that. And like we said, just because we're doing work differently doesn't mean it is wrong. It doesn't mean, we can't all hop on board. So we hope to get some experts on both those topics, and have you join us again for another BridgeWorks community conversation. So again, on behalf of Emily, myself, the team at BridgeWorks, thank you so much for joining our community conversation today. And we hope to see you next time.